All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of Emerging Revolutionary Wars ERW Revelries that we do bi-weekly on Sunday nights. I'm Kevin Pollock, a historian with ERW, and I'm pleased to be joined this evening by historian and author Scott Patchen. Scott, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here tonight, Kevin.
Well, you're very welcome. Absolutely. Scott and I have been in different circles in the Civil War world before, but it's good to be talking about some Rev War topics with you this evening. So, for those of you familiar with Scott's work, you might be more familiar with it in the Civil War, but Scott's just come out with a book earlier this year. There you go. You got it. Perfect. George Washington and the French and Indian War, published by the History Press in 2024. So, Scott, I want to give you some time to pitch the book, and obviously, we'll get into some details tonight. But go ahead and tell me what's your interest in the topic, and frankly, why another book on George Washington? There's a lot of those out there, as you know.
Well, actually, this book started my first interest in history when I was growing up as a child. My father was from that area, and we lived in Ohio, and we were always out visiting. And the first battlefield I ever went to was Fort Necessity National Battlefield. And, and it just created this yearning to just love to walk battlefields and figure out what happened. We went there, and I can remember the soldier dressed up in red, and I'm about 6 years old, and I'm thinking George Washington and the Continental Army in blue coats, and I'm like, wait a minute, something's not right here. And there, but he did a firing demonstration. I've still got a picture of me standing there with the Virginia soldier there on the ramparts outside of Fort Necessity. So it's always been near and dear to my heart. It's a beautiful area. It's pristine. One of the least undervisited sites probably in all of the national military parks out there is Jumonville Glen, the site of Washington's first military action, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. But so, I just always kind of wanted to do something with it. And I think one of the things that I really tried to do with my book is to look at George Washington a little bit differently. Not so much to look at him as the future leader of the American Continental Army and the first president of the United States, but as this 22-year-old kid who's out here leading a mission for Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia, and with very specific orders. So I'm trying to put everything into perspective. And in doing so, I think it gives a better understanding of the actions that Washington takes when you look at the big picture there. Virginia and Great Britain at the time, they're concerned with French incursions on what was believed in their eyes Great Britain's territory. The French just as strongly believe that this Ohio country, which is all out there, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, parts of Kentucky, and Western Maryland, they both believed they had a legitimate legal right to this. And Washington will find himself front and center of that brewing struggle.
Very good. So tell us a little bit about George Washington. I know he's obviously the focus of your book, but you talked about, before a lot of people I don't think are certainly as familiar with Washington's role in the French and Indian War as they are obviously with him being the father of the country in the American Revolution. What gets George Washington to the point of being able to lead troops early on in the Western frontier?
Well, he's one of the youngest sons. His father would die in 1732, and his two older brothers, Lawrence and Augustine, had the benefit of going to England for their education and receiving the finest education. But after his father dies, Washington does not have that, whether it's because the resources weren't there or because he was a younger son. He was never going to get that anyway. But Washington inherited this driving ambition. And initially, he wanted to be in the British military, was one of his goals. And at one point, he was going to try and sneak away and joined the British Navy. And it's his mother's intervention through his oldest brother, Lawrence, that they were able to put a stop in that enlistment there. His mother heard about some of the abuses and the hard life in the Navy and wanted nothing of that for her son. So George would be well connected. He would go and live with his brother Lawrence at what we know today as Mount Vernon, and just nearby was the influential Fairfax family. The scion of this family, Lord Fairfax, who held title to hundreds of thousands of acres of land, was out in the Shenandoah Valley, not too far away from Winchester, Virginia. And he needed to have this land surveyed. So Washington had had some education in the area of surveying, and he's going to go out with the son of George Fairfax, and they're going to go out to the Shenandoah Valley, and he's going to start surveying. Now, Washington's going to have a real quick learning curve there, not just about the surveying, but life on the frontier. Although the Washingtons weren't the richest family in Virginia, they were quite well off. And when George gets out there and starts seeing the rough ways of living on the frontier, for example, one of his first nights out there, he decides he's going to sleep in a tavern bed, and he'll wake up the next morning covered with lice and other fleas and things. And he decides at that point that it would be best to sleep in front of the campfire every night rather than to go into one of these inns or taverns of the 1740s. So Washington will gain great exposure out there. He's also going to round up thousands of acres for himself that he's going to purchase out there and claim. And one of the things that happens while he's out there is that he's in Western Maryland in Old Town, not too far from Cumberland, Maryland. He'll be at what was a plantation, which is really just a small fort or settlement there. And his first brush with Native Americans came in, and he was quite fascinated watching them do their dancing and singing and chanting, and wrote a very descriptive account of this. So he's seeing a lot there. And he's also learning a lot about the land and the rivers and the streams and the mountains and the roads, or more likely trails in most of the cases. So he's gaining a lot of information. And he's going to come back from this, knowing a lot more about this Ohio country than probably most people in Virginia at the time. He'll go on, and in 1752, he's going to go down to the Caribbean when his older brother Lawrence is sick. They thought that it would be good for his health and constitution with that environment. While there, George is going to be exposed to some of the upper crust of English aristocracy, as well as the British Army, exploring the fortifications and learning a lot before they realize that it's not really helping Lawrence, and they will return to Virginia. George Washington, upon his return, he will go to Williamsburg and deliver some messages to Governor Robert Dinwiddie. And this is in the summer of 1752. So it'll be the first connection of many between young Washington and the governor of Virginia. Lawrence would die in the summer of 1752, and Washington would at that point want to become a major of one of the militia districts. He hoped to have the Northern Neck district, which was near Mount Vernon in the northern area of Virginia, but he would eventually get it, but he'd have to settle for, I believe it was the Southern District there. And so he's in command of the militia, which was not as great of a military experience as it might seem, but it was something, and it was something to put on his resume. Now, in spring of 1753, the French begin moving southward. They're coming down out of Canada. They've already got a fort up near Erie, Pennsylvania. And they're going to start pushing down the Allegheny River Valley, or what they call La Belle Riviere, the Ohio River, and building more settlements further south in 1753. So Dinwiddie's going to grow alarmed at this development. and he's going to be notifying the mother country and the king in London of what's going on out here, and they will actually start be sending some armaments back to Virginia. But in the fall of 1753, George Washington is going to take a message from Dinwiddie that essentially is going to tell the French, you are on British territory and you need to leave and all will be well. And it's literally a sealed letter with Dinwiddie's stamp on it, and he's to carry this. He will venture out through Winchester, Virginia, up through what's now Western Maryland, West Virginia, Southwest Pennsylvania, all the way up until he gets to the area near what's now Pittsburgh at an Indian village called Logstown. And it's there that he's going to make his first acquaintance with Tanagreeson, who is known as a half-king. And I'm going to back up here a little bit and give you a little background on Tanagreeson, or the half-king, because he's going to play a major role in George Washington's first military expedition in 1754. So the half-king, he actually was born a Catawba Indian and had been captured into the Seneca tribe. Now, the practice is that they would take these hostages, and that is how Indians would partially repopulate their tribes from losses during warfare. And so it was a situation where they're treated very well. So he grows up with the Seneca. The Seneca are part of the Iroquois League out of New York. And the half-king is sent down here to preside over this region. Now, the vast majority in terms of population-wise are Delawares and Shawnee who live out there in this Ohio country. There are a few scattered members of Seneca and some other Iroquois tribes who are kind of known as Mingos in the what's now Western Pennsylvania. And they are under the half-king. Now, the larger tribes out there, the Shawnee and the Delaware, because they had been crushed previously by the Iroquois League in war, they were subservient. So it was up to the half-king to kind of keep an eye on them and report back occasionally to Onondaga, where the Iroquois League was headquartered. So it is thought the English, from the Virginians, they think that this half-king holds a lot more sway than what he does. And so they're thinking, let's get this guy on our side. He's got all these, and we can get all these Indians to ally with us. One of the other things to talk about with the Native Americans and the French is the French had significantly cultivated excellent alliances and relationships with many of the Canadian and Great Lakes area tribes. And so they had a lot of experience, and there seemed to be more of a mutual respect. One of the things I think a lot of people don't know is that when the French and Indian War breaks out in 1754, there's really only about 75,000 or so French living in New France or Canada, versus there's about 1 million English and others settled in the English colonies along the eastern seaboard. Just to give you an idea relatively of how the two sides compare to each other in terms of population resources available for the coming war. So these French, as they move down, they're bringing gifts, and one of their objectives is going to be to cultivate relationships with the Shawnee and the Delaware Indians. Well, Washington waits around for a couple of days, and the half-king, who was always full of promises, say, well, we got to wait a little longer. There'll be more people will show up to go with us. Because one of his missions from Dinwiddie was to, hey, get a large force of these Indians together to escort you up to see the French, so that, you could give off an appearance of some strength in there. But instead, Washington leaves with his small force of escorts and just the half-king and a couple of other young warriors. And they'll reach the first French fort, and they'll be told they have to go on to the next, and then they get to that one. They said, well, the actual commander that you need to talk to is not here yet. Now, I'm going to go ahead a little bit forward here. Again, remember, Washington's mission is to deliver a message to the French to leave the English lands. He's going to be in a reverse situation where he's going to be the intended recipient of a French message from a French messenger in the spring of 1754. And so one of the things now that Washington is also charged with is to do a little spying while he's out here. Learn all he can of the disposition of the French forts. Learn all he can about the strength. He's counting canoes. He's learning that a lot of the troops have gone back to Canada for the coming winter. But he's looking at the number of canoes and the supplies that have been built up in the French forts in the Allegheny Valley. When the French officer arrives, Washington right away realizes that he's a man of much military experiences and is kind of in awe of him and respects him, gives him the message. As everyone might think, the French will take this into the other room, have their interpreters look at it, and probably had a good laugh about it. And, then they come out later and let Washington know that, no, we're not. They don't tell Washington that. They write a response, seal it, and it's up to Washington to take that back to Dinwiddie there. That's how the official response is delivered. It's not verbal, but there will be a letter sent. So Washington will then hightail it out of there, head back southward. He'll have a couple of adventures along the way as he's heading back there, and while he's still up along the Allegheny River. At one point, they'll come across an Indian who claimed to be friendly and ends up taking a pot shot at Washington there. Another time, they're on a raft him and Christopher Gist are cruising down the Allegheny River towards the forks of the Ohio, and it overturns in some rapids, and Washington nearly drowns in the freezing cold water. But they ultimately were able to make it. And by early January, Washington is back in Williamsburg. And when Dinwiddie gets the news of what is transpiring out there, he decides that it's time to act. Washington's going to get orders to head out to the Shenandoah and recruit 100 of the militia from that area to take out to the Ohio country. Another captain, Captain Trent, is going to be ordered to. Trent is a frontiersman, and he's got a lot of connections with men who are actually living over in the mountains in what's West Virginia and Western Maryland. And he's going to get about 40 men together, and they are going to head up to the area where they'll first go out to what's now Brownsville, Pennsylvania, on the Monongahela River. And they will build a small stockade that is largely to begin storing supplies. The real objective of Trent is to go to the forks of the Ohio, modern-day Pittsburgh. If you go there today, you can see there's the Fort Pitt Museum, and there's also an outline of the French Fort Duquesne right there, where the Monongahela and the Allegheny come together to form the Ohio River, right across from where the Pittsburgh Steelers play their football games these days. So Trent's going to get out there, and he'll get up there, and he will spend about the middle of April. His men are trying to work on building a fort, but they're running low on food. They thought that they were going to be able to reach out to the Shawnee and the Delaware to do some hunting for them, but the Delaware and the Shawnees, they respected strength, and they knew that the French force that was to the north was significantly stronger. And there were even more French now that in the spring of 1754 who had come down from Canada and would soon be showing up at the forks of the Ohio. When they do show up there on April 17th, they are going to overwhelm the small force. Captain Trent and the second in command are nowhere to be found. The second in command had gone off to his home settlement, and Trent was heading back towards Cumberland area, or what was known as Wills Creek back in the day, looking for more supplies. The Half King is there though, and so when the French force, which is about 500 to 700 men and 9 pieces of artillery, show up and start arraying around outside of the fort, they give the second in command, as an ensign, they give him an hour to make a decision. Now the Half King's raging. He's like, "No, we can't do this. We can't surrender," and he nearly creates a fracas. But the French had dealt with him before, and he had threatened to attack them if they did not leave back in early part of 1753, and they knew that he did not hold a lot of sway over the Indians, so they kind of took him for what he was worth, and as that was sort of a blowhard, and they disregarded him. The Ensign Ward, the acting commander of this small force of 40 men that had just started to build the English fort near the forks of the Ohio, prudently surrenders and marches off. Of course, the French are cordial. It was by force of arms. They displayed their force and their artillery, and Ward knew that he had lacked the resources. So after a friendly dinner that evening, he marched off and returned with his small force to Wills Creek in a few days. Now, by the time this has happened, George Washington himself has left Alexandria. So we got to back up. Remember, he first was out in the Shenandoah Valley in February, and the militia decided, we weren't too much up for this mission. So Dinwiddie decides we're going to have to recruit a regiment. It's called the Virginia Regiment. And by the beginning of April, Washington has got about 160 men, several officers. Now, to give you the nature of the type of men that he's getting, Washington, in one of his correspondences with Governor Dinwiddie, says, "Hey, we got to do something about uniforms. A lot of these guys are joining up because they're in rags." So he's struggling there. Dinwiddie will also get some more men and ship them up from the Tidewater area. But on April 2nd, he's going to march out of Alexandria, Virginia, go across Fairfax County through Hillsborough to Vestal's Gap, and then on to Winchester, Virginia. Washington will start moving a little bit ahead of his force. They'll go out to what was known as Pearsall's Settlement, or Fort Pearsall, which is now Romney, West Virginia. And from there, they'll head up the south branch of the Potomac River towards Old Town, where several years earlier, Washington had his first experience with encountering Native Americans. And when he gets there, over to a place on the south bank of the Potomac River there it was Fort Ohio. It's immediately south of what's now Cumberland, Maryland. And Fort Ohio was one of these storehouses that the Ohio Company, which held title to all these lands out here for the British, was building up a supply of stores for trading and settling out in this region. So while he's here, he gets word. Ensign Ward arrives and tells him that the British have been forced from their intended fort at the forks of the Ohio. Now, Washington had very specific orders from Governor Dinwiddie. And his orders are to, act on the defensive, but if any of the works or our settlements, and the works being referring to the fort that they were building, are interfered with, you are to arrest or kill or capture the perpetrators. So if you're young, aggressive George Washington and you're on this mission, suddenly you're like, "Hey, they've driven our men off." He probably feels that he has the green light now to go out there and arrest, capture, and if they resist, even kill them, because they had driven off this British force that were constructing the works there at the site of what would become Pittsburgh. So Washington's only got 160 men, and he's going to notify Governor Dinwiddie of the developments. He knows that he's got another half of the detachment of the Virginia Regiment coming up under its commander. Now the actual commander, the colonel, is never going to make it to the front. Washington, as a lieutenant colonel, and as ambitious as Washington was, when he was lobbying for positions, he was very careful to ask for the second in command position so that he could serve under an older and somewhat more experienced officer and learn from him. But as it turns out, that will never happen. It's always going to be Lieutenant Colonel George Washington front and center, leading this campaign for Virginia in 1754. He will have, again, about another 150 men or so coming forward from the Virginia Regiment. Reinforcements are coming up. 100 men of a company of regulars from South Carolina would soon be there. There were 2 more companies of approximately 200 men that were supposed to be coming down from New York, and a volunteer regiment out of North Carolina of about 300 to 400 men. So Washington's feeling confident that he should move across and establish some sort of a bridgehead and monitor affairs and await the arrival of these reinforcements. So what he's going to do at this point is he's going to head out from Fort Ohio, Wills Creek, Cumberland area, and head across Western Pennsylvania, what's now Western Maryland and Western Pennsylvania. And he will arrive at the Great Meadows, which is now the site of Fort Necessity National Battlefield there. And Washington there, you know, some of his naivety, it's kind of a bowl-like structure. And Washington talks about how the streams flowing through there form a natural entrenchment for defenses. But it is one of the few open areas where the horses can graze in the fields, and he can set up an encampment there. So he's going to start off there for a while, but he's going to determine ultimately to march to the Monongahela River, to the site of what's now Brownsville. And this is where Captain Trent had built a little small stockade with the supplies. Now, as he starts moving out in that direction, he'll learn that French have sent out patrols. And so he's going to just hold tight at the Great Meadows there. And he's trying to get more information about French dispositions. As the month of May goes on, the French are going to send out a force of about 35 or 40 men under the command of Ensign Jumonville. Now, Jumonville's mission, let me just back up a little bit. You know, the Indians in the area are reporting everything that Washington's doing back to the French at who have now constructed Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. Washington would later remark that the French built their fort on the exact proper spot that Washington had noted in his journal in 1753 that was the spot where you should build the fort. And Trent, it was somewhat off from that. And Washington took pride in the fact that the French had agreed with his selection of the location of the fort. So the French, when they learn this, they're going to send Jumonville out with about 35 men. Jumonville does have a summons telling Washington to go back to his side of the mountains. But strangely, at the same time, the French commander, Captain Contrecoeur, which was the highest rank in the French military in New France at the time. The French military was basically marine companies, and Contrecoeur was the commander. And then so he was one of the most senior captains in the French military forces. And he's in charge of Fort Duquesne and all the operations in this region. But his orders, in addition to the summons that he's carrying him, tell him, when you locate the British force, send a pair of fast legs back to the fort and let us know where he is. So that's important. That'll come into play later on with some of the developments. So I think it's about May 21st that Jumonville moves out, heads down the Monongahela River, and then goes overland and starts scouting the area there, towards Fort Necessity, doesn't get quite to it. But the Half King is his small band is reporting back that the French are out there and they're looking for Mr. Washington. And the Half King says, he actually reports to Washington that the French army is coming after George Washington. Now, the Half King, he knows he's in a tenuous situation, and he can see that the Shawnee and the Delaware are starting to gravitate toward the French sphere of influence, and that means that he's going to lose his. So he would like nothing more than to see a conflict between the English and French, because he believes that he could use that to his advantage if he sides with the English in the situation. So he's going to be playing up, the French threat to Washington. And again, remember, George Washington has no military experience here. Another thing about George Washington, it's interesting, when he's still in Alexandria, he's giving Governor Dinwiddie some advice about dealing with the Native Americans. And he's saying, well, we need red uniforms. They respect red and the sign of blood. And every man has to have a red uniform. And he's just kind of talking like he's an expert about the Indians, when a couple of weeks later here in early June, he's going to write a letter to Governor Dinwiddie and say, hey, can you send out one of your Indian experts and someone who knows the language? I could really use the help in that regard, paraphrasing him there. But anyway, as Jumonville's out there across the countryside, it's rainy. He's going to come across a settlement from Christopher Gist. This is the same Christopher Gist who had accompanied Washington on his expedition to warn the French off of the English lands in 1753. They're going to be raiding his settlement, which is only about 7 miles away from the Great Meadows Fort Necessity site. And he'll get some word of that. And then Gist himself, the 27th May, will come into camp and confirm that they're out there. Washington, just as the Half King's trying to get Washington more into things, he tells some young Mingos that were at Great Meadows, he says, the French are there and they want to kill the Half King. And so this young Indian races off to about 6 miles away and notifies the Half King. And the Half King has already had scouts who's located these French. And they're encamped at what today is known as Jumonville Glen. And if you walk in there today, you kind of walk down a rugged, rocky trail, and you go down to this sun, and it's almost like a natural quarry. At the walls about 40 feet high, natural rock walls, and the French are camped down in there. It's about a half a mile off of the main trail, and Washington views them as hiding there before they do something, take action against him. The French claim that they're in there because it's bad weather, heavy rains, and it's a good place for a shelter in the woods. Be that as it may be, on the evening of May 28th of 1754, Washington is going to start sending out detachments. He's going to send out half his force, and they're going to march right past this and completely miss it. But then he gets this messenger in from the Half King in that evening, and he takes about 40 men, leaving only a small force to guard the supplies at Great Meadows. And on this rainy night, he's going to march through the woods, and he's going to arrive at the Half King's camp a couple miles away from where the French are located. And together, they are going to devise a plan. Now, it's interesting. Historian David Preston found a document when he was working on his excellent work on the Braddock's campaign in 1755. He found this document in the English archives. And in there was an account of some of the other chiefs who were with the Half King and Washington at Jumonville Glen, and giving their account of what happened. And so it seems what actually happens there is these men had scouted the area, and so they are really calling the shots here. Now, as they move forward to here, you know, Washington sees this mission as a mission to strike back at the French before obviously they're there lying in secret, trying to hide away, and so he wants to hit them before he can be hit. And the Half King, you know, the Half King's trying to stir things up between the French and the English, but he also believes that his father had been killed by the French, boiled, and then eaten. And so he had a long-held vendetta. And then the French had repeatedly disrespected him when he had ordered them off of the lands in what's now Western Pennsylvania. And so he really wanted to go after the French. But so they're going to arrive there at about 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. on the morning of May the 28th. And the French are going to be just waking from their morning breakfast, shaving, getting ready for the day. And Washington and the Indians are going to deploy basically most of Washington's men would be about half of them would be on these heights on the rock walls looking down at the French. Washington would lead the other half of them around to seal off one side of the ravine. And the Indians would go off to the northern end and lay in ambush in the woods. This was basically the only way out that the French would have. And so there's a lot of debate actually over who fired the first shot, who fired it. Well, really doesn't matter who fired the first shot because George Washington made a decision to go out and attack them there. That was his whole purpose for joining forces with the Half King there. And so some say that Washington, the Indian account that Preston had found in the archives in London actually says that Washington himself fired the first shot as a signal for the attack to begin. Other accounts say that the French heard some of the English creeping up on their camp and that a sentry opened fire. Be that as it may, Washington's men attack and quickly overwhelm them, and the French start fleeing towards the north end of the camp. And as they do so, the Indians are going to come out of ambush and attack. It's going to become a very confused situation here. It seems that some of the French had been shot when Washington attacked, but the Indians are going to start killing and scalping. The French are going to flee back up more to the south towards where Washington is at and seek protection from Washington. Now, as this is going on, a very confused situation, firing going on. The horror here of them seeing these men scalped in front of them. Washington, to me, seems to have just lost control of the situation and is probably dumbfounded and stunned by what he's seeing. The commander, Jumonville, had apparently been wounded, and he's, through an interpreter, trying to get Washington's attention and telling him, you know, here he's a diplomat. He has a message for you. He's here only for a message, and that's all kind of lost in what's going on. But it comes to a head when the Half King himself approaches Jumonville and calls him my father. And the French, the Indians always referred to the French, those who were allied with them, as the father figure. And he says to him, "You are not yet dead." And with that, he takes out his tomahawk and strikes several vicious blows to Jumonville's head, splitting his skull open, and then rips his brain out and squashes it in his hands. One onlooking Virginian wrote that the Half King washed his hands with Jumonville's brain. So it's going to take some time here, but Washington at length is going to regain control of the situation. Now, out of the 13 French casualties that were there, 12 of them were killed and scalped. Washington is finally able to convince the Half King that they have enough scalps. The scalps were viewed by the Native Americans as trophies of battle, and they needed, when they went into battle, this was what was expected of them. So Washington finally gets things under control. They head back to the Half King's camp, and then Washington will then quickly get away with the prisoners and take them back to the Great Meadows encampment. These prisoners will ultimately be sent back to Williamsburg as prisoners there. At this particular point in time, Governor Dinwiddie himself has gone to Winchester, Virginia, where he's hoping that the Half King is going to come to Winchester, but the Half King refuses, saying it's a time of war and I can't leave my people here. But the spark has been lit. Washington would write a letter to his younger brother Jack and tell him that he'd heard the bullets whistle, and this would get back to the King of England, and he'd make some sarcastic comments about it. But Washington, ironically, when he gets back to camp that day, and on the 29th, he's going to start writing a report to Dinwiddie about what had happened. Washington's first subject in that report is not about explaining what happened here at Jumonville Glen on May the 28th of 1754. No, what he begins addressing is he had received a response from Governor Dinwiddie where Washington had been complaining about the enlistment circumstances of the men in the Virginia regiment. And Washington had been complaining, taking up the cudgel on behalf of the officers of the Virginia regiment who were complaining that they weren't paid enough. They learned that officers in the British regular establishment made more money and that they should be paid the same. Washington said, well, I'm not quitting, but I'm going to serve as a volunteer officer rather than serving at such a low rate of pay that it was beneath his dignity. And Dinwiddie would write back and he would express dismay that a man in whom he had expected so much and held in so much confidence sounded as he did in this letter. So Washington's initial part of his report back, and this is, like a page long, more about making excuses for why he did what he did and why he wrote what he wrote, and trying to back out of that tactfully. And then it's kind of like, oh yeah, by the way, we have this engagement yesterday, and Dinwiddie never heard any of the details about what happened with Jumonville, the specifics of it. But it's viewed by them as a great victory. Now, one of the things I like to point out about Washington here, just in terms of the engagement there, Dinwiddie was never upset. He never viewed that Washington had crossed the line in attacking the French there, because obviously it said when the French struck at the forks of the Ohio against Trent, that's where they viewed the spark of war had been lit. So Washington's going to hang out there. And one of the things that he's going to learn is that the colonel of the Virginia regiment had fallen off his horse in Cumberland, hit his head, and subsequently died. And now Washington is the colonel of the Virginia regiment. The man who takes over as lieutenant colonel is with the half of the regiment back in the Cumberland area. And George Muse is his name, and he's somewhat of a coward, and it's going to take a lot of cajoling on the part of Dinwiddie to get him to go forward with the rest of the regiment and join Washington. It won't be till the middle of June that he joins them. Washington will also be joined at the Great Meadows by Captain McKay in command of the 100 South Carolinians, bringing the total British force out there at Great Meadows to about 400 men. Now, one of the lessons that George Washington is going to learn in this campaign, and again, I focus on this campaign when looking at him in the French and Indian War, because here is Washington as an independent commander leading a campaign. Logistics. He's been promised the world from all kinds of vendors but they can't get the wagons, they can't get the supplies, they can't get the teams. and Washington's men are running short on food. And it's going to be the Achilles heel of his campaign. So by the middle of June, he's strengthened, and he decides that he's going to attempt to head back out to Redstone here. And as he's doing so, he's only going to get as far as where Gist Plantation was before all the wagons break down and they start running out of supplies. And then they get word that there has been a large reinforcement of the French at Fort Duquesne. Among the reinforcing officers was the older brother of Jumonville, Captain Coulon de Villiers. Then de Villiers would arrive there in late June, just as Contrecoeur had been assembling a force to go out and exact vengeance for the death of Jumonville. So Washington is out there, and he gets word that this force is coming. He sends a messenger back to Great Meadows to Captain McKay, and McKay agrees to bring his regulars up to the front at Gist, about, again, 7 miles north of Great Meadows. They hold a council of war there in late June, and they decide that this is an exposed position and that the French could get behind them and cut them off from their retreat to Cumberland without even having to fire a shot. So they are going to fall back to the Great Meadows. Now, Washington's men by the end of June are in haggard condition from the lack of rations and supplies. The horses, the wagons have broken down. They have about 10 swivel guns, and they've had to carry them by hand. And when it comes time to head back from Gist Plantation to Great Meadows, Washington's men seek the assistance of the regulars to help them with the menial work of carrying all these supplies back. Well, British regulars don't do menial work unless they're getting extra pay, and Washington had no extra pay there. So his straggling, haggard advance is going to head back to Great Meadows. Now, they hope that maybe some of these other reinforcements from the New York regulars or the North Carolina volunteers would be there. But the New York regulars made it into Alexandria. The North Carolina volunteers straggled and deserted all the way back to North Carolina. And there was hardly any supplies had been delivered to the Great Meadows. So Washington's getting this report about this large force being sent out against him. And so he's going to continue to fortify and build Fort Necessity, which is a very small fort with a small shed in the middle, and which the supplies were locked up. It was said that part of this fort was created as much to keep the riffraff from the Virginia regiment from pillaging the rum and supplies as it was to protect them from the British. He'd also build entrenchments on the outside facing south, and then he also had a couple of streams in the area that his men would use there. It would be July 3rd when Captain Coulon de Villiers' men would show up at Great Meadows. Now, on their morning march here, they had swung by Jumonville Glen and saw the unburied remains of their brethren, including Jumonville. And they stopped and offered Catholic prayers and gave these men a proper Christian burial before moving on to Fort Necessity. This force that actually arrives there is varied in numbers, but it's probably about 500 French and 100 or 200 Indians moving there. Most of these Indians were not from the region, but they were from the Great Lakes in Canada, and they are going to be moving forward to attack. When the first shots will ring out early in the morning and Washington's men will be called to attention. It's been raining all night. The trenches are filled with water and mud. The whole area there is a quagmire. The French would, again, they would get close to the fort at about 11 o'clock, open fire, and they would advance. Washington would be out in front, leading the troops forward to confront the French in the open ground as they moved to attack Fort Necessity. And he's out there with Captain Mackay leading the British regulars forward. However, George Muse, now in command of the Virginia Regiment, is supposed to be following to support them. He starts calling out. He says, the French are going to take our fort while we go out here. And he led the retreat back towards Fort Necessity. So Washington at this point in time had no other recourse except to fall back to the trenches. And it's going to be there that the French will make one sortie against them. But they're going to realize that, they would take heavy losses if they assault these fortifications head on. So they're going to content themselves with just encircling the fort. Again, it's in a meadows, and the wood line is right up to within musket range. So the French and Indians can continue to take pot shots at the Virginians and South Carolina regulars there. Throughout the day, Washington's force would lose about 100 of 300 effectives. He had 100 men total, but they were so sick and starving that they were not fit for duty. So he loses a third of his effectives and a quarter of his entire force in the engagement. French losses were fairly negligible, maybe a dozen men or so. But they will have him completely encircled by the time evening rolls around on July 3rd. There had been some gunfire, heavy storms. The French reported that shortly in the evening that the British increased their firing at them. And the French, though, although they had the numbers and advantage, Captain Contrecoeur realizes, my men, they only have the ammunition that they've brought with them on their backs. So he's going to send out a request for parley. And so Washington turns it down at first, thinking that it's some type of French trickery. But de Villiers persists, and this is going to lead to Washington signing a surrender document. And this is going to happen in the middle of the night, completely dark by candlelight. All the documents are wet. But one of the key aspects of this surrender is that Washington acknowledges that he has assassinated Jumonville. And de Villiers writes this document up. They both sign it. Now, the story is Washington didn't realize it was in there. There's copies of the document, and the word assassination in French and assassination in English you probably would know it. Washington claims that he was misled by his interpreter and did not know this. Either way, Washington had caught a break, and he was going to live to fight another day, and he was going to take it. He would surrender all of his swivel guns the next morning, except for one. They were allowed to march out with their battle flags and the honors of war. They would quickly bury and abandon the swivel gun because they were too tired and worn out to carry it any further. They would reach Williamsburg. Washington would. The force would remain at Winchester, Virginia, and Mackay and Washington would go and explain the situation to Dinwiddie. George Washington's going to remain in good stay with the political powers in Washington. Dinwiddie himself is ready to arm up again, recruit, and let's see if we can relaunch this campaign before the winter gets in. And Washington's kind of flabbergasted by this. But as Washington's reputation is going to start taking some nicks and hits here as rumors start coming in about things that happened. One of his officers, Major Adam Stephen, who would be a division commander under Washington during the Revolutionary War, would pen a letter to the Williamsburg paper, and in it he would say essentially, all of these stay-at-home men who are brave to stay at home while Washington was out there would likely have signed any agreement to have escaped that. For if Washington had shown excessive bravado and not accepted this surrender, perhaps the whole command would have been killed and captured at the hands of the French at Great Meadows. Eventually, Washington is going to grow so frustrated, he's going to learn that a retired captain from Maryland from the British Army is going to be given overall command of the coming expeditions, that Washington's had enough. And by October, he's going to go to Williamsburg and resign his commission. And with that, he's really ending his biggest contribution to the French and Indian War.
Very good. Well, that was great, Scott. We have just a couple of minutes left. You touched on this briefly, but I want to just throw it out there. What do you think are some lessons that George Washington learned from this experience that you talked about with this independent command that he carried forward throughout his career?
Well, I think logistics is one of the big ones there. You know, you need men, money, and logistics to make these campaigns. And the other thing that he learned, that it's one thing, you know, to look at this on a map and say, we're going to go put a fort out here where Pittsburgh is at, and, you know, just expect that things are going to happen. He also learned about the importance of alliances when he learned the hard way that he had the short end of the stick in terms of the number of Indians who were supporting him. And one of the things I didn't mention is the Half King and his band of Indians, when they learned that this big French force was coming, they kind of vanished there and left Washington on his own there. But you know, and it was a hard lesson for him. Young Washington was very prideful. I didn't get into, but you know, several times throughout the French and Indian War, George is, when things don't go his way or rank issues, he's always threatening to resign. And you're going to see, you don't recognize the selfless man who led the Continental Army through those dire winter at Valley Forge and on to victory at Yorktown there. You know, it's a lot of personal growth is going to occur in the intervening years.
It will definitely show, that's for sure. So, Scott, again, I want to thank you for giving us a great talk about George Washington War. Real quick, where can people find you and where can people buy a copy of the book?
Well, the book is available on Amazon.com, and I am on Facebook, so shoot me a friend request there. Always happy to make new acquaintances. I do a lot of tours for the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation as well, and the Blue and Gray Education Society every year. So there's a lot of things coming up. I just like to share a little something here. There is a distillery up in the area of Fort Necessity, and his whiskey is named Half King Whiskey. So
that distillery is on my list of places to go the next time I'm up that way. So everybody, everybody will want to grab a bottle of the Half King whiskey, grab a copy of Scott's book as well, and make your way out to Fort Necessity National Battlefield and Jumonville Glen when you head out that way. It's well worth your time getting out there.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, Kevin. It was great being online with you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for joining us this evening. Thanks, everybody, for watching. If you want more Emerging Revolutionary War content, you can find us online at emergingrevolutionarywar.org and on our YouTube channel and Facebook as well. Thank you all for joining us. And Scott, thank you very much. And you all have a good night.